Have you ever been surrounded by people and still felt completely alone? Not because nobody has talked to you, not because you had no friends, but because you were the only one willing to stand where you were standing. Maybe everyone around you laughed at something you didn't find funny. Maybe they expected you to stay quiet when you knew something wasn't right. Maybe they all seemed certain and you were the only one asking questions. That kind of loneliness is different. It's not the loneliness of being forgotten, it's the loneliness of conviction. History is full of people who stood alone before anyone stood with them. The person who spoke up against bullying, the employee who refused to cut corners, the friend who challenged gossip instead of joining in, the scientist whose ideas were dismissed before they were accepted, the whistleblower who lost everything because telling the truth mattered more than fitting in. Standing apart isn't comfortable. Human beings are wired to belong. We naturally want acceptance. We want people to nod along and say, "You're one of us." So when the crowd turns one way and your conscience points another way, it can feel incredibly isolating. You begin to wonder whether you're the problem, whether it's easier just to stay quiet, whether keeping the peace is worth more than keeping your integrity. But here's something I've learned. The crowd isn't always right. Sometimes being alone is simply the price of thinking for yourself. And often the people we admire most today were the people who looked strangely out of place in their own time. So if you ever find yourself feeling alone because you're standing for honesty, kindness, fairness, or truth, don't automatically assume you're taking the wrong position. Sometimes you're just standing a little earlier than everyone else. And perhaps the most important question isn't, am I standing with the crowd? It's, can I live with myself if I don't stand here? Because there are different kinds of loneliness. The loneliness of standing alone and the loneliness of abandoning your values. If I had to choose, I'd rather stand alone than lose myself. But I think there's something people don't talk about enough. Standing alone doesn't always feel noble in the moment. It doesn't feel like history. It doesn't feel like courage. It often feels uncomfortable, quietly uncomfortable, because you still hear the laughter, you still see the approval you're not part of, you still feel that instinct to soften what you believe just to re-enter the room. And that pressure is subtle. It doesn't shout at you. It just asks, is this really worth it? And sometimes the hardest part is not the standing, it's the waiting. Waiting to see if anyone will eventually agree with you. Waiting to find out if you misread the situation. Waiting for proof that you didn't isolate yourself for nothing. Because when you're alone in your thinking, you don't just lose agreement, you lose confirmation. And humans aren't just social creatures, we are reflective creatures. We need to see ourselves mirrored in others to feel certain we aren't completely wrong. So when that mirror disappears, you start to question your own clarity. But there's another layer to this. Not every crowd is the same. Some crowds are just unfamiliar with new thinking. And some crowds are actively uncomfortable with it. Because what you're really challenging isn't just an opinion, it's a shared assumption, a shared silence, a shared agreement not to look too closely. And the moment you break that agreement, you change your position in the group. Not because you attacked anyone, but because you stopped participating in what everyone else was maintaining. And it's probably a bit scary for them. And this is where it gets complicated, because not every moment of standing alone is meaningful. Sometimes people stand alone because they are right. But sometimes people stand alone because they are early. And sometimes they are just isolated. And those three things can feel exactly the same at the beginning. So the question becomes less about comfort and more about clarity. Not, am I alone, but what exactly am I standing on? Because conviction without reflection can harden into isolation, and belonging without conviction can soften into silence. And most people drift somewhere between these two without ever noticing. They slowly trade honesty for ease, then ease for acceptance, then acceptance for disappearance, until one day they realize they are no longer standing anywhere at all, just fitting in. So when people say, be yourself, it sounds simple, but it's not. Because yourself changes depending on what you're willing to risk. It changes depending on whether you can tolerate disapproval. It changes depending on whether you can sit in silence without rushing to fill it with agreement. And maybe that's why this feeling is so powerful. Because it forces a choice most people avoid. Do you want to be understood? Or do you want to be honest? Sometimes you can have both, but not always at the same time. And here's what makes it even harder. Over time, you stop needing disagreement to come from others. You start anticipating it yourself. You begin to silence your own thoughts before anyone else can challenge them. That's when standing alone becomes something else entirely. Not a moment, a habit. But if you're still there, still noticing, still questioning what others overlook, still unwilling to trade truth for comfort, then maybe this isn't just loneliness. Maybe it's awareness. And awareness has never been comfortable. Because history doesn't remember the most agreeable voices, it remembers the ones who are willing to be out of step long enough for the direction to change. So maybe the real question isn't whether you feel alone right now, it's whether you can stay honest long enough for alignment to catch up. And that might be the real cost of standing alone, waiting for the world to arrive. Because sometimes being alone is just what truth looks like before it's accepted. Have you ever been in the situation yourself where you have taken a stand for something you believe is right and you've ended up feeling really alone in doing so? But you've had the courage to continue that because you knew it was the right thing to do. I have. I can think of times when I've walked out of places because I knew what was happening was not right. And, I wasn't obviously friends with those people, close friends with those people, and anymore, if I was to start with. And I've also had one time when I walked down on something because it wasn't right, but a person actually came to my door with flowers afterwards saying, hey, I really admired you for taking that stand. So that was a bit of an unexpected payoff. Yeah, so if you've got any experiences of yourself of standing alone and want to share any details about that, I'd love to hear what they were, and please put them in the comments below. Yeah, it's a really important topic. There's all sorts of different types of loneliness, and sometimes it is good to be alone and sometimes it's not. Thanks for watching and listening, and please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.